And just down Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the Capitol is the offices, the Washington Bureau of Mother Jones. That's where we're going to take you back now to talk to Mother Jones' dark money reporter, Andy Kroll. Andy Kroll, thanks for coming on. What is dark money for folks who haven't heard that term?
Dark money is this term that we've used to describe the secret money that is flowing through our elections at the state, at the local, and of course at the national level. It's money that moves through nonprofit groups like Crossroads GPS, which is Karl Rove's group, or we used to have a group called Priorities USA that was aligned with President Obama. And it's really, we've seen an explosion of what we call dark money, and it's this money where we don't know who the donors are. We don't know in many cases how the money is actually being spent. And so we have made it a priority of ours here, and mine in particular, to try to shine a light on this secret money that is having an incredible impact on our elections, yet we know so little about where it's coming from and how it's shaping the debate and our campaigns and our politics.
So how do you go about doing your work for Mother Jones? How much of it is mining public databases versus having documents given to you by sources?
It's an all of the above approach, to be honest. I mean, if you really want to know anything about tax forms and 990s, I'm your guy. I mean, it's been sort of a crash course in tax law and how nonprofit organizations work and how super PACs work. Using the Federal Election Commission as well. And so, as you said, there's a lot of mining those sorts of information sources, and there's a lot of information out there. Also a lot of corporations tell us how they spend their political money, but they sort of hide it with a little link on their website in the bottom left corner, and you really got to know where to look and how to find it. So there's a lot of that out there. As you mentioned as well, there's also a lot of publishing, a lot of work in getting your name out there and your email address out there, and hoping that people who care about this issue, and they're out there, will send you information that you can't otherwise get, that you can't find in a database of nonprofit groups, or you can't find on a corporation's website. And there's also a lot of, building up a network of folks here in Washington and elsewhere, sources who are entrenched in this stuff and who may not want their name attached to it, but can kind of give you the lay of the land or give you some tips or insight as to how this whole, money-moving machine works today in this, sort of cash-drenched post-Citizens United world, if you will.
Do enough reporters today care about campaign finance and sort of follow the money issues? What do you think the state of journalism is on that particular coverage front?
Yeah, there's two levels to this, from what I can see. I think there are a lot of great reporters here in Washington who are covering this beat. Folks at Politico, folks at National Journal. You have the Center for Public Integrity. You have a lot of really good folks, friends of mine, competitors as well, who are sniffing around in this beat. But where you don't see this kind of coverage, and frankly, where this money can have some of the biggest impact, is at the state level. This is in state legislatures and state capitals around the country. I just came back from a reporting trip in Lansing, the capital of Michigan, my home state, and it was amazing to turn up some things and wonder, how did the state, press corps not figure this out or dig this up months and months ago when it happened? And those press corps, those groups of those publications are decimated in many states, and those follow the money stories aren't really being told.
If you want to talk to Andy Kroll about some of his work for Mother Jones, our phone lines are open. Republicans can call it 202-5853-881. Democrats 202-5853-880. Independents 202-585-3882. You can begin dialing in now or post your comment on Twitter or Facebook or email us. But in the meantime, Andy Kroll, want to point to the latest issue of Mother Jones. Your story is The Triumph of the Drill. Tell us about this story.
Right, the story came out of an idea, or rather a conundrum, which is you have, oil companies that are some of the wealthiest corporations in the world, recording some of the largest profits in the history of corporations. At the same time, they're receiving these really generous tax breaks and subsidies and other kind of perks totaling many billions of dollars from the federal government. And that just doesn't make sense. Why do they need that? when they have all the money in the world. More money than they can count, more money than they know what to do with. And so, that was the premise of the piece, and it was digging into, okay, what are the ways that they preserve what they have? What are the ways that they got these breaks? How do they keep them? What are they worth? What's the history? The piece is sort of a visual spread. It veers from, actual basic numbers about these tax breaks and who gets them, to conspiracy theories about like how oil subsidies might have had a role in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It goes all over the place. But really the core question is, it's a matter of influence in politics, and how does the oil industry keep these seemingly unjustifiable tax breaks alive. And
a few of the numbers from that story, from the charts with your story: the estimated annual tax breaks for the big five oil companies: Chevron, about $700 million; ExxonMobil, $600 million; ConocoPhillips, $600 million; BP, $300 million; Shell, $200 million, and plenty of other charts throughout your story there. I want to bring in Vanessa now from Washington, D.C., calling on our line for Republicans. Vanessa, we're talking with Andy Kroll, the dark money reporter for Mother Jones. Thanks for joining us. Vanessa, are you there? I think we lost Vanessa. We'll go to Mark this morning from Ocala, Florida. Mark, good morning.
Good morning, guys. And I like the host, and Andy, I love your level of enthusiasm for seeking out the truth. I'm so old, I shook John Kennedy's hand, and then as a child, I campaigned for Bobby after John was shot, and I grew up in a lucky household that listened to Martin Luther King speeches live the first time. I also, at age 18, voted for President Carter as a young Marine, and I couldn't wait to get on embassy duty. I was stationed in Okinawa. I do have a question, sir, for Andy. Just wanted to give a background, establish some bona fides for the listeners, for myself. But as a young Marine, I couldn't wait to get on embassy duty. And once I got on embassy duty, I ended up in Central America in 1978 in Honduras. And then from there, a couple of years later, I ended up in Argentina. I learned so much about the world and our domestic economy. And what Andy talks about actually ties all of this in together. Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins is another a great book, and I'm sure Andy's familiar with John Perkins. But
well, Mark, what's your question for Andy?
Well, my question is, I just wanted to compliment them because they're open sources, and I do have the question, sir. Their open sources with Mother Jones are so excellent. It's almost like I'm still on embassy duty reading things or listening to CIA agents that that teach people what's going on. But my question for Andy is if he could, what he might know concerning dark money and the connections to the Reagan administration, Bain Capital, and the El Salvadorian plantation owners and the death squads, and how actually Mitt Romney was warned possibly not to do business with the people, and that's how the creation of Bain Capital even gets started, from the money, so they could prevent people from making a living wage by killing union workers like myself and college students in Latin America, so we could have cheap towels at Walmart.
Andy Kroll, something you've looked into at all?
I can't say that I've looked into that subject before. I mean, to pull a piece, I guess, out of what Mark had to say there. He mentioned Mitt Romney, he mentioned Bain Capital. I think about the 2012 presidential campaign, and this was really an election when we saw this issue of dark money and also super PACs, and just a flood of outside money into our elections. And it was a fascinating period to be a reporter on this beat, because I think since the first time, really since Watergate, when we got our the scandal that led to the laws we have today, in large part, we just saw the money pouring in a completely unprecedented way. And it's only going to get, I guess, bigger, more money, or worse if you don't think that's how it should be in 2014 and then especially 2016.
Let's go to Matt now from Plano, Texas, on our line for Independence. Matt, good morning. You're on with Andy Kroll.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call, and thank you for C-SPAN. Good morning, Andy. I wanted to ask, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Stock Act, I do not think it passed Congress. I think, is that correct?
I think what we ended up with was a neutered version of it, in which it did not cover congressional staff, or at least that was the latest status of the Stock Act, and that was kind of the most important part, so the advocates for it were disappointed.
doesn't surprise me. I remember hearing stories about, Maxine Waters' staff who was involved in a scandal with a bank. And I think that's the biggest problem is we look at all the money that comes into elections and into these so-called independent PACs, which really aren't independent. But it's even worse when you have members of Congress using information from their committees to, enrich themselves and to help their friends. And I think that hopefully you can do a lot more reporting on that and, help root out some of this, dark money that's going on, inside of Congress. I believe there's something like 400 lobbyists for every member of Congress. And until we start getting in the inside, once they're in office, and showing how they're profiting themselves while they're there, I think, you're just going to see more. It's just going to continue.
Andy Kroll, I want to point out a highlighted piece from June 19, 2012, before the 2012 elections. Your Follow the Dark Money piece. And in that piece, you note that the basic pattern of campaign finance is scandal and reform. I wonder, what part of that pattern are we in now?
Well, I think we're absolutely in the pattern in which the laws and the sort of the safeguards that were built up in the wake of the Watergate scandals are eroding, and they're falling away. And they're falling away because you have a very well organized, very well funded, very smart conservative movement that has chipped away at these laws. And there's a lawyer that I write about in the piece, a fellow named Jim Bopp, who has sort of led that charge. And we're really at a place now where, again, like I said, the money is coming in from the outside, from these supposedly independent super PACs that the caller mentioned. And now the Supreme Court is poised to open up more money for the parties if it decides in a more conservative way on this standing case McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission. So I would absolutely think we're in the former part of that scandal response, scandal reform equation than we are in the latter, because the reform side, they aren't tallying many wins right now, whereas the folks who believe in less regulation and more money coming in are absolutely they're the ones who have the momentum.
Ken Weeks asked you, can we expect balanced news coverage from your organization, specifically on the issue of dark money reporting? Do you investigate folks on the left as well as the right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one reason I like this job. I like Mother Jones is, I can go after both sides. I mean, I recently wrote a piece looking at a plan developed by some of the largest Democratic donors, progressive donors in the country, that are with this group called the Democracy Alliance, and they're planning what they call a $40 million surge to push back against the conservative side of this fight, against the Jim Bopps, against the Mitch McConnells in the Senate, who's been a big sort of leader in the campaign finance effort. I wrote about this story, broke that story. I can tell you from my emails that the people who I wrote about were far from pleased. But those are people on the progressive side, and there's been other stories like that as well, some that I've come on C-SPAN to talk about before. So this is absolutely a bipartisan issue, and we cover it in exactly that way.
AJ is from Memphis, Tennessee, on our line for Democrats. AJ, you're on with Andy Kroll.
Hello.
Hi, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, this is AJ. Would like to comment on how the country is selling themselves out to these big companies, and I would like to comment on how the company is selling themselves out to these big companies, big superpower companies, and they are buying the country up with their money. I truly do believe that Chief Justice Roberts set this all up by putting out a bill or a law that they could do that. I think this is nothing but greed in the country to buy people up, buy the country up, and then they run the country like they want to.
Andy Kroll, I think AJ was referring back to the Citizens United case. If you can talk a little bit about the continued impacts of that case.
Absolutely. I mean, Citizens United was the case that in part brought us super PACs. It's the case that helped unleash this, torrent of dark money through nonprofit groups into our elections. And Citizens United is an interesting case to study when you look at it over the course of Chief Justice Roberts' time on the court. I mean, a lot of court experts really see him being on a sort of progression of slowly dismantling the campaign finance laws, the foundation of those laws that we got in the mid-1970s. It's in Citizens United is by far the biggest there, but this upcoming McCutcheon case would be another instance of that. In this case, loosening the rules for parties, and then potentially, some court watchers believe, he could knock down the limits giving directly to candidates and parties themselves, and maybe even the limits on corporations giving to candidates. A ban that's been in place for a century. So the Citizens United case was very much the most high-profile decision on this issue by the Roberts Court, but it's very much in a string of cases, and we don't know how this is going to end yet either.
Marianne is from Bulls Gap, Tennessee, on our line for Independence. Marianne, good morning.
Good morning. I have a question about dark money. When the representatives who are supposed to be representing us shut down the government over Obamacare, the stock market went down. When the government resumed, the market went up the same day. Since these representatives get a heads up over market movements, how many of them made money, who were they, and how much?
Andy Kroll.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it gets back to what the previous caller had said about the Stock Act. And there absolutely is the potential for folks on the Hill to, act on information that they've learned or that they've acquired, about the stock market and about how the government moves markets in a way that the average public can't. And now the way that members of Congress disclose their financial holdings, we don't know right now who profited off of that market's dip and then its increase when the government got back into working business again. But it's going to be interesting to see when those disclosures do come out, if anyone made a few bucks off of that. And again, this is what the Stock Act was intended to fix, and it sort of took a small bite at the issue. But the folks behind the Stock Act say it hasn't gone far enough yet, and they're continuing to try to tighten up those reforms so that we don't see people profiting off of that information.
Joseph on Twitter asked, Mr. Kroll, does equating money with free speech give those with it more free speech than those without?
Well, that's an argument made by folks who believe we need to have healthy, strong restrictions on money in politics, that if you are, Las Vegas casino magnate Sheldon Adelson or the hedge fund guru George Soros, and money equals free speech, well, you got the ability to put out a lot more speech than the average person, making $40,000 or $50,000 a year does. Now, the conservative side of this completely disagrees and says any restriction is a restriction on free speech rights. We can't have that, and this is the fundamental tension in this issue. And it's interesting and at times difficult to write about, but I can definitely see that argument. I mean, the average person can't start a super PAC and fund a super PAC and hope to, play in a House race or a Senate race. Certainly not a presidential race. But someone with $1 million or $2 million or $10 million to spare can, and that's a big difference, and that matters in elections.
Stephen is from Woodbridge, Virginia, on our line for Independence. Stephen, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm glad I got through. I have to agree with the one lady that just called about influencing the stock market. To use a metaphor, I think the Republicans and the Democrats, they're actually wings of the same bird, the right and left wing of the same bird, with the head of the bird being whatever president there is. I feel that this is all a charade, this dysfunctionality between the parties and the charade of, opening and closing the government, and then opening at the 11th hour, knowing full well, that these actions influence directly the stock market and the stock prices, and profit from this tremendously. And I think, it's just a charade and just a way of, some connect to make money.
Okay, we'll go to Jack from Prescott, Arizona, on our line for Democrats. Jack, good morning.
Morning, guys. And, I wanted to make a comment. One day, just to make people aware of how ridiculous speech is money, or money is speech, I purposely went out and tried to pay my cable bill, the electric bill, and at the grocery store. And to make those people aware, I asked them how long I would have to speak to pay my bill. And guess what? All of them wanted money, which makes the distinction that money is not speech. And there's just too much money, and it's the corporations controlling our Congress, and the best way, and people won't do it, but if we would all vote for the guy that had less money to run his campaigns, that would give them something to think about. But I appreciate C-SPAN and Mother Jones. Keep it up.
Well, Andy Kroll brings up the question, if you've studied this issue a lot, if you could reform the campaign finance system, how do you think you would do it to make it work well?
From looking at the different kinds of reforms out there, and looking at least the legal climate right now, putting hard restrictions on how much a candidate can accept or give, a party can spend, and so on. I mean, all these kinds of restrictions are in trouble, are doomed from the start, because you have a conservative Supreme Court that doesn't believe that they should exist, that doesn't believe they're constitutional. Now, the reforms that have always intrigued me the most, or seem to have the best chances, are what's called public financed elections or citizen-led elections. And this is a system that, instead of capping, or you're talking about restrictions or caps, it rewards candidates for raising lots of small donations, and then it basically takes public money and matches raising donations up to a couple $100, something like that, and it encourages a candidate, for instance, Bill de Blasio, the Democratic candidate in New York, used this system masterfully in the Democratic primary. He ran around and raised a lot of money in small batches from a lot of different people, and heard a lot of people, and won their support, and then that money was matched. And that doesn't seem to raise the same kind of constitutional questions. You're not talking about restrictions. You're talking about rewarding people for courting as many small donors as they can, and that's the preferred reform from folks on the left right now, and it seems to be the best chance of taking some kind of step toward tamping down this big money political system we have right now.
One more caller. We'll go to Joel from Lynchburg, Virginia, on our line for Republicans. Joel, good morning.
Good morning. Hey, y'all.
Good. Go ahead.
First, one comment and then a question. The comment is that as long as we keep getting the same people back in there, the dark money will always be there. I mean, the only way you can ever change that is to get people in there that have integrity and will not take money. The question is, did you do a article on President Obama's first election about, John McCain wanted to have the private financing or the public financing, and Mr. Obama ended up not doing it, and I don't think anybody ever found out where his money came from.
Andy Kroll.
Well, I would say to the caller, I mean, we do know where his money came from, because in terms of the money he raised for his campaign, it was a record-setting amount, of course, more than $700 million. I think about $715 million for 2008. We know where it came from because it's disclosed. We know who raised the big dollar amounts, because the so-called bundlers, these super fundraisers, were also named by the campaign. But the caller's absolutely right. President Obama said he would use public financing. He then opted out. John McCain, a longtime advocate of campaign finance reform, felt a little burned around that, and that's something that we did cover, and then we've covered it again in 2012, looking at how much President Obama relied on big donors, looking at post-election how Organizing for Action, the rebooted version of his campaign, has wooed donors by offering them access to the president, and the money in politics issue applies to President Obama without a doubt, and we've covered it along the way, and we'll continue to do so even now, and then looking toward 2014 and 2016, cover those candidates, and Hillary Clinton, of course, as well.
A few of Andy Kroll's most recent pieces on Mother Jones' website who's really behind Campbell Brown's sneaky education outfit. Leaked documents reveal the secret finances of a pro-industry science group, and California watchdog Koch brothers network behind $15 million dark money donations. You can see all of those at motherjones.com. And Andy Kroll, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.